In the heart of the frontier, where survival was measured by grit and silence often spoke louder than words, one widow dared to stand against cruelty. She had already endured the harshness of the land, the loneliness of nights without her husband, and the endless weight of keeping her ranch alive. But when the foreman, a man feared by many for his merciless ways, pressed his power upon her, she refused him with the same steel that had kept her family's legacy from collapsing. What she did not know was that rejection would not end the matter. It would set in motion a night that the valley would never forget. The foreman, humiliated and burning with vengeance, left her porch in silence. Yet his silence was not surrender. Beneath the wide hat shadowing his eyes, there burned a promise of retribution. To be denied by a woman who had lost everything was, to him, a wound to his pride, a scar no drink of whiskey could soothe. As he rode into the night, whispers followed him through the town, whispers that carried dread, for all who knew his temper also knew he would not rest until he had reclaimed what he believed was his. Inside the widow's home, the air was thick with unease. She busied herself with the evening chores, her hands steady, but her mind restless. Every creak of the wooden floor, every gust of wind rattling the shutters seemed sharper than usual, as if the night itself was warning her of what was to come. Yet she stood firm. The ranch was her last tie to the man she had buried, and she would not let it fall into the hands of someone who ruled by fear. The moon rose high, casting its pale light across the empty fields, when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. Slow at first, then heavier, until they reached her gate. She froze, her heart pounding as shadows moved across the yard. He had returned, and this time he was not alone. The glint of steel in his hand caught the moonlight, a weapon carried not for work, but for vengeance. The cruel foreman had come armed, and his intent was clear, to claim by force what he could not by will. And so the stage was set, a widow with nothing left but her courage, and a foreman consumed by pride and fury. The night held its breath as their fates collided, the ranch itself standing as the battleground between defiance and cruelty. What unfolded within those hours would not only test her strength, but would also leave a scar upon the valley, a story carried in whispers long after the dust had settled. The widow stood at the doorway of her ranch house, her lantern trembling in her hand as the sound of boots scraped against the porch. The foreman's figure loomed in the shadows, his hat pulled low, his breath heavy with whiskey and rage. He did not knock. He simply stood there, staring, his eyes reflecting the moonlight and the steel he carried at his side. In the silence, the widow felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. She had rejected him, defied him, and now the price of that defiance had come to her door. Inside, the walls of the house seemed to shrink as fear pressed against her chest. Yet she would not let it show. Her late husband had built this ranch with his blood and sweat, and she had vowed to protect it even after death had taken him from her. The foreman's presence was not just a threat to her safety, but to the very legacy she carried. Her grip tightened on the lantern, her voice steady though her heart thundered. She told him to leave, but her words only fueled the fire in his eyes. The foreman took a step closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He reminded her of all he had done for the ranch, of the years he had served her husband, of the debts he claimed she owed him. But his words were not of loyalty, they were of possession. He wanted control, not partnership, and her refusal had become an insult he could not forgive. With every sentence, his voice grew darker, the tone of a man who believed the world owed him everything he demanded. The widow's mind raced, but she did not retreat. She thought of her husband's memory, of the long nights she had endured alone, of the children in town who looked to her as a figure of quiet strength. She would not bend now, not to a man who mistook cruelty for power. Her defiance sparked something even stronger in him, and she saw the glimmer of violence in his stance. Still, she did not back down. In the distance, a wolf's howl broke through the night air, echoing across the empty plains. It was a sound of both warning and omen. The widow knew the night would not end without blood or consequence, and as the foreman's hand rested on the grip of his weapon, she felt the world narrow into a single, fragile moment. Courage and fear collided within her, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would not surrender. The foreman's rage filled the silence as he stepped into the house uninvited, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. The lantern's flame flickered in the widow's trembling hand, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Every movement seemed louder, heavier, as though the house itself sensed the danger within its walls. The widow retreated only far enough to keep her distance, her eyes locked on the man who now threatened everything she held dear. He spoke of power as if it were his birthright, reminding her of the lawlessness of the frontier, a place where strength often outweighed justice. His words carried venom, laced with the pride of a man unaccustomed to rejection. He told her the town would side with him, that no one would dare challenge his authority. But the widow, though her voice shook, reminded him that fear was not respect, and that cruelty could never build a legacy that endured. Her defiance cut deeper than any blade, and he knew it. Outside, the ranch hands stirred in their quarters, awakened by the echo of raised voices. They had seen the foreman's temper before, had felt the sting of his cruelty, but none had dared confront him outright. Yet tonight was different. Tonight, the widow's courage stood as a beacon, daring others to follow. One by one, figures emerged in the yard, drawn toward the sound of confrontation, uncertain whether to intervene or to wait for the inevitable. Inside, the widow's hands brushed against the cabinet where her late husband's rifle rested. She did not reach for it yet, for she knew that one wrong move could ignite a storm of violence she might not survive. Instead, she relied on her words, on the unshakable truth that this ranch was hers to defend, not his to claim. Her voice, though trembling, carried the weight of a promise. He would not break her spirit, no matter how he tried. The foreman's jaw tightened, his pride wounded deeper with every second she stood her ground. His hand hovered near his weapon, the line between threat and action thinner than the air between them. The widow braced herself, knowing that the night had reached a point of no return. One choice, one spark, and everything would change forever. The West had always been unforgiving, but tonight it would decide between mercy and blood. The tension thickened as the foreman's hand lingered dangerously close to his weapon. The widow's breath came slow and steady, her eyes fixed on him like steel sharpened by years of hardship. She had seen death before, buried love with her own hands, and weathered storms that broke stronger men. This man, no matter how armed or furious, was no storm. He was flesh and blood, and she refused to let him believe otherwise. The foreman sneered, his pride cut deeper than any wound. To him, her defiance was a humiliation worse than poverty, worse than pain. He spat venom in his words, accusing her of weakness, of foolishness for standing alone in a world where women were often crushed under the weight of men's ambitions. But his voice betrayed something more dangerous than hatred. It betrayed desperation, a man clinging to power that was already slipping from his grasp. The widow's voice rose, calm but unyielding. She reminded him of her husband, of the men who had worked this ranch with sweat and blood, of the sacrifices carved into the very soil. She spoke not as a woman pleading for mercy, but as the rightful guardian of a legacy no one could steal. Her words pierced him more than any bullet could have, for they carried truth, a truth he could not bend, no matter how tightly his hand gripped steel. Outside, the ranch hands drew closer, the glow of lanterns flickering through the windows. They had followed the foreman for years, endured his cruelty in silence, but now they stood at a crossroads. Their loyalty was no longer to him, but to the widow who embodied the courage they had never dared to show. The weight of their decision pressed against the night, every second stretching toward the inevitable. The foreman, sensing the shift, grew restless. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator ready to strike. But the widow did not retreat. She lifted her chin, her hand now resting near her husband's rifle, her eyes unblinking. The air was thick with the promise of violence, yet her stillness carried more power than any weapon. In that moment, the balance of the West hung on the edge of her defiance. The standoff stretched into eternity, the silence broken only by the low crackle of the hearth. The widow's grip tightened on the rifle, though she had not yet lifted it. The foreman's hand twitched near his weapon, every heartbeat daring him to draw. But in his eyes, there was no certainty, only the gnawing realization that he was no longer feared as he once was. The widow's courage had exposed his weakness, and he despised her for it. Then, from outside, came the unmistakable sound of boots against gravel. The ranch hands had stepped forward, their silhouettes now crowding the porch. Their presence was not loud, not violent, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that shifted the balance of power without a single word spoken. For the first time, the foreman was outnumbered, not by guns but by loyalty redirected away from him. The widow seized the moment. Her voice rang steady, commanding not just him but the men beyond the door. She declared the ranch her ground, her husband's legacy, and no one, not even a foreman armed with steel, would take it from her. Her words echoed across the walls, across the night, and into the hearts of those who listened. This was not simply a declaration of defiance. It was a claim of authority no one could deny. The foreman's face twisted with rage. His pride screamed for him to draw, to prove his power once and for all. But his hand, heavy with hesitation, never left the hilt of his weapon. The widow's stillness, the men's silent shift of loyalty, the weight of the ranch itself pressing down on him, all of it stripped away the courage he thought he carried. His fury burned, but his will faltered. In the heavy quiet, the truth became clear. This was no longer his fight to win. The land, the men, and the widow herself had turned against him. And though he had come armed with steel and vengeance, he found himself disarmed by something far stronger, the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to surrender. The foreman's chest heaved with unspent rage, his fists clenching as though he could still seize control through sheer force of will. Yet every second that passed made his defeat clearer. The widow's stance never wavered, her rifle within reach, her gaze locked on him like a sentinel carved from the very earth. Behind her, the presence of the ranch hands grew heavier. Their silence spoke louder than any gunshot. They had chosen their side, and it was not his. The widow felt her heart pounding, but she did not allow the fear to show. She remembered the promises she had whispered to her husband's grave, the vow that she would never let the ranch fall to greed or cruelty. This moment, tense and dangerous, was not just about survival. It was about keeping that vow alive. Her voice, steady as the wind across the plains, told him one last time to leave. Not begged, not pleaded, commanded. The foreman's pride recoiled. He had built his reputation on fear, carved his place in the West through violence and dominance. To be dismissed like a common drifter by the widow, in front of men who had once trembled at his name, was a humiliation too deep to bear. His hand twitched again near his weapon, but his eyes darted to the shadows outside. He knew if he drew, he would not leave the ranch alive. For the first time in years, the foreman felt the cold grip of isolation. No allies, no loyal hands, no woman bending to his will. Just the echo of his own arrogance and the sharp edge of her courage cutting through him. The weight of the ranch shifted entirely away from him, and in that crushing silence, he understood that his reign of intimidation had ended. He stepped back slowly, his boots creaking against the porch, the steel at his side useless. His eyes burned with hatred, but his pride could not mask the truth. He had lost. The widow had broken not just his power, but the illusion that had sustained it. And as the night swallowed his retreating figure, the ranch stood stronger than ever, guarded not by guns or fear, but by the defiance of a woman unshaken. The night air seemed lighter once his shadow disappeared into the darkness, yet the silence that followed was far from peaceful. The widow lowered her hand from the rifle, her body trembling only now that the danger had passed. The ranch hands filed slowly into the yard, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of awe and respect. For years they had endured the foreman's cruelty, but tonight they had witnessed his undoing, and it had not come from them, but from her. The widow stepped out onto the porch, lantern in hand, and looked upon the men who had worked alongside her husband for so many years. For the first time, she saw no doubt in their faces, no hesitation. Their silence was not fear, but allegiance. They had chosen her, and the realization struck her with both relief and responsibility. She was no longer just a woman guarding her home. She was the heart of the ranch itself. One of the older ranch hands, his hat worn and his voice rough from decades of work, stepped forward. He told her that her husband would have been proud, that she had shown more strength in a single night than most men carried in a lifetime. His words carried no flattery, only truth, and they struck deep into her soul. She had not fought for pride, but for survival. Yet in doing so, she had become a figure larger than she ever imagined. Still, she knew the foreman's retreat was not the end. His pride had been wounded, his power broken, but men like him rarely vanished quietly. Somewhere beyond the valley, his hatred still burned, and she could feel its weight pressing against the horizon. She would need to be ready, for the West never left wounds untended, and vengeance often returned when least expected. But for that night, the widow allowed herself to breathe. She stood under the vast sky, the stars burning like watchful eyes above her, and felt the strength of the land course through her veins. The ranch, once fragile in her solitude, now stood fortified by courage and loyalty. She had faced cruelty head-on and had not faltered. The story of the widow and the armed foreman would travel through whispers in the saloons and markets. But here, under the silent gaze of the prairie, it became something more, a testament to resilience in a land that demanded nothing less. The dawn that followed was painted in muted gold, the kind of sunrise that promised both beauty and hardship. The widow stood on the porch with weary eyes, watching the cattle stir in the distance. The events of the night clung to her like dust on her skin, a reminder that peace in the West was always fragile, always borrowed. Yet beneath her exhaustion pulsed a quiet strength. She had faced the foreman's fury and remained unbroken, but she knew his shadow still lingered beyond the horizon. The ranch hands resumed their work with a new kind of discipline. Where once they had followed the foreman out of fear, now they worked under the widow's watch with respect. Every hammer strike, every tightened rope, every mended fence seemed to carry a silent declaration. This ranch would endure. The men had seen courage unlike any they had known, and it bound them to her in a way that no contract ever could. Inside the house, the widow walked through rooms still heavy with her husband's memory. She paused by the mantel where his old revolver lay untouched, a symbol of a past life when she had been shielded by his presence. Now, that weapon seemed to look at her with expectation. She had not needed to fire the night before, but she knew there might come a day when her words alone would not be enough. Her thoughts wandered to the foreman. She imagined him riding through distant canyons, his anger festering like an untended wound. He had been humiliated, stripped of power in front of the very men he once commanded. That kind of defeat rarely faded. It burned until it consumed. Though she had won the night, she knew the war between them was far from over. Still, she refused to let fear dictate her life. As she opened the windows and let the morning air sweep through her home, she whispered a vow to herself and to the land. She would not cower, not yield, and not abandon the ranch her husband had left in her hands. If the foreman returned, you would not find a widow weakened by fear, but a woman forged stronger by every trial the frontier had cast upon her. Whispers of the confrontation spread quickly through town. By midday, the saloon was alive with talk of the widow who had faced down the armed foreman without firing a shot. Some called her reckless, others called her brave, but none denied her resolve. The story traveled faster than the winds across the plains, reshaping her image from a grieving woman holding on to scraps of a legacy into a figure of defiance and authority. Merchants, ranchers, and drifters alike repeated the tale, each adding their own embellishments. Some claimed she had stared the foreman down until he quaked like a child. Others swore she had nearly fired before the ranch hands intervened. The truth mattered little. What mattered was that her name was now spoken with respect, sometimes even with awe. In a land where reputations were everything, hers had been reforged overnight. The foreman's reputation, on the other hand, began to crumble. Men who had once followed him avoided his gaze in town, unwilling to be associated with a man who had been bested by a widow. His pride festered in silence, his every step weighed down by whispers he could not silence. Though he tried to walk tall, the truth clung to him. He had been broken, not by gunfire, but by the unshakable courage of the woman he had tried to conquer. Back at the ranch, The widow prepared for the days ahead with both caution and conviction. She doubled the night watches, instructed the men to keep weapons close, and moved with a discipline that showed she understood the storm was not over. Yet even in her caution, she never let fear overtake her. Her leadership was calm, firm, and clear, the very qualities that had once belonged to her husband, now alive in her. As night fell once more, the widow stood at the edge of her land, lantern in hand, watching the horizon. The air was still, the stars silent witnesses above. She knew the foreman would return. Men like him never surrendered. But she also knew the truth. The ranch was no longer defended by one woman's will alone, but by loyalty, respect, and a spirit forged in fire. Whatever came next, she would face it, not as a widow clinging to the past, but as the unyielding guardian of her future. Days turned into weeks, and though the foreman did not return, the widow never allowed herself to grow complacent. Each sunrise brought with it both labor and vigilance. She walked the fence lines, checked the cattle, and oversaw the work with a sharp eye, but her hand never strayed too far from the rifle that now rested on the porch. To her men, she became more than a figure of authority. She became a symbol, a living reminder that courage was not born of strength alone, but of conviction. At night, when the house grew quiet, she often sat by the hearth and replayed the confrontation in her mind. Fear still lingered, but it no longer defined her. What had once felt like a nightmare now became a testament to her resilience. The foreman had come with steel in his hand, certain she would bow, and yet he had left defeated by her defiance. That truth gave her strength, even as she braced for the day when his shadow might darken her door once more. The townsfolk began to seek her counsel, something that surprised even her. Ranchers asked her advice on disputes, widows asked for guidance in keeping their homes, and even young cowhands looked to her with admiration. The story of her stand had traveled far beyond the valley, and with it came respect she had never sought but now bore with grace. In the Old West, where legends were often forged in violence, hers had been born in defiance, and it inspired those who had long felt powerless. But beneath the respect and admiration, she carried a private burden. She knew the foreman's pride would not let him disappear quietly. Each whisper of him in nearby towns, each rumor of a man seen drinking too heavily or staring too long at the horizon, reminded her that this story was not yet finished. His silence was not peace. It was the gathering calm before another storm. Still, she refused to let that dread consume her. She told herself that if he returned, she would meet him again, not as prey, but as a predator in her own right. The West had taken much from her already, her husband, her peace, her innocence, but it had also given her a strength she had never known she possessed. And if the foreman chose to cross her path again, he would find not the widow he thought he could control, but a woman sharpened by fire. The final reckoning came on a night thick with storm clouds, when the wind howled across the plains and thunder rolled like distant gunfire. Lanterns flickered in the ranch house as the widow sensed the shift in the air. The foreman had returned. His figure appeared at the edge of the property, a lone rider outlined by lightning, the glint of his weapon visible even in the darkness. This time, he had come not to intimidate, but to reclaim his pride, even if it cost him everything. The ranch hands rose to meet him, their rifles steady, their eyes unwavering. They no longer feared him, for the widow's courage had forged in them a new resolve. Yet she stepped forward before they could act, lantern in one hand, her late husband's rifle in the other. She would not let this end in chaos. This was her battle, her stand, and she intended to face it with the same fire that had once forced him to retreat. The foreman dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the mud. His eyes burned with hatred, but behind that fire lay desperation. He had been stripped of power, mocked in saloons, forgotten by the very men he once commanded. To him, this confrontation was not about land or even about the widow. It was about pride, about reclaiming the piece of himself he had lost that night she had defied him. The storm raged overhead as they faced one another, the ranch hands forming a silent wall behind her. The widow lifted her chin, her rifle steady, her voice carrying above the wind. She told him this was his last chance to turn away, to leave behind the poison of his pride and vanish into the horizon. But his laughter, bitter and broken, told her all she needed to know. He would not leave without blood. And so the West held its breath as thunder cracked and lightning tore the sky. In that charged moment, where vengeance and courage collided, the widow stood unyielding, her figure framed by stormlight. Whatever happened next would etch itself into the memory of the valley, not as the story of a cruel foreman, but as the legend of the widow who refused to bow, a woman whose defiance became stronger than any weapon drawn against her. The storm that closed over the valley was more than thunder and lightning. It was the symbol of every battle the widow had endured. She had faced grief, loneliness, and the cruelty of a man who believed fear could bend her will. Yet in the end, it was not his steel nor his fury that defined the night, but her courage. Her defiance turned into a shield, her resolve into a weapon, and in standing firm, she transformed from a grieving woman into a living legend of the frontier. The foreman's downfall was inevitable, for the West had no place for men who ruled only by fear. His pride had consumed him, and his hatred became the chain that dragged him to ruin. The widow, in contrast, rose from loss and carried her husband's legacy with dignity. Her story proves that true strength is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to yield to it, and that even in a land as harsh as the frontier, justice finds its voice in those who dare to stand tall. The ranch hands, once silent under his cruelty, now stood united under her leadership. What began as one woman's struggle for survival became the foundation of a community bound by loyalty and respect. Her defiance had not only broken a tyrant, but had given the men around her permission to believe in something greater than fear. This was her victory, not in the defeat of one man, but in the rebirth of a legacy that would endure long after the storm passed. And so the tale of the widow spread, carried by whispers through saloons and campfires. It was not told as a story of violence, but as a testament to resilience, a reminder that in the Old West, the fiercest battles were not always fought with bullets, but with unshakable will. Her stand became more than survival. It became a message that no matter how heavy the night, a single act of courage can light the horizon for generations to come. If this story moved you, let its lesson stay with you. Strength is not measured by the weight of your weapon, but by the resolve of your spirit. Share your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a like if it stirred something within you, and subscribe to the channel so that together we can keep alive the voices of the frontier, voices that still echo with courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding fire of those who refuse to bow.